let's talk about climate change, okay? So when you say climate change, you know this now. This is one term that is given to everything. Hey, naimvua January, climate change. It's not rained in a couple of days, climate change. You know, the trees are not growing as tall as they used to, climate change. The soil here is looking, it's more acidic, climate. Everything now is all climate change. But maybe we need to start defining what exactly is a direct result of climate change and what may be as an indirect result of climate change and what other things are just because the earth is doing what it's doing. It's part of nature. Let's bring in an expert on this matter. Dr. Edwin Mungai, he is the Group CEO of the Kenya Climate Innovation Center, KCIC. Good morning, Dr. Ari.
Good morning, Eric.
Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the Situation Room.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, for having me, and I'm really looking forward for punching upwards, and also getting a little bit deeper to that chameleon, and climate change.
Does a chameleon do this because of climate change?
Well, I think it's us who should do like a chameleon when you're tackling climate change and look on all directions. I think that's the point.
Before moving.
Before
we actually get into the deeper stories on climate change, tell us about the Kenya Climate Innovation Center. What's that?
Well, yeah, Kenya Climate Innovation Center were established in 2012 by the World Bank. And the sole reason for that was really to help the private sector to look at climate change as an opportunity. I mean, Eric, you've been talking about everything is being now blamed on climate change. And indeed, we see it as the biggest threat that is facing humankind in the 21st century. But there is also an opportunity. And our job really is to provide an enabling environment, to provide the skills and the technical skills in this case, and as well, business skills and financing to private sector so that then they can embrace climate change as an opportunity and they innovate around it and probably make our world a better place.
All right. So we talk about climate change, like now everything is just being slapped with climate change, this and the other. But if we look at Kenya specifically, and from where you sit, what can you say is happening now, which could be directly attributed to climate change, the negative effects of climate change? And what can you say that may be as a result of climate change happening in other parts of the world, not directly being contributed by Kenyans?
Well, I think let's first of all try to define the scope of climate change here. And climate change is not an isolated, it's not something which is happening in one place and not in the other. And the effect of climate change will be felt, globally, meaning that it's universal. The only difference is that some places will be impacted more than others. And that leads to the question about Kenya. Of course, climate change have consequences when it comes to even health issues. It comes with agriculture challenges. It also comes with even infrastructure challenges when you are building roads and in 6 months those roads are gone because of the rains that we are receiving. So it is a broad concept, and indeed that's why probably I'm not prophesizing here saying that climate change is actually bigger than COVID, COVID-19 as a pandemic. And indeed, we need to prepare ourselves for it. The only difference between COVID and climate change is that climate change, it takes time. And as it takes time, we have an opportunity truly to be able to, reverse those effects. And reversing the effect is not about just reducing on carbons by 15 or 20%. It's actually going to zero. And that is the commitment that government, we as individuals, private sector, civil society, we must all commit, to going to zero. And hopefully then we can be able to have a better world.
Dr. Mungai, you talk about this and saying that we're all trying as, nations, industry, committing to having these carbon emissions at zero. It's a part of a big conversation. But then it's also been recognized that African nations actually contribute the least in terms of these emissions, however, are suffering the greatest in terms of their effect on the environment. Is that the case?
Yes, indeed. That's the position, that in terms of amount of contribution, in terms of the challenge, is very minimal. And also is about the level of industrialization, is also the level of activities that we're having with the continent. Remember, climate change comes together with the level of activities that are, happening. And there is always this argument, and sometimes it becomes political, that probably it's our time as the developing countries to pollute. It is our time, because when you look at the developed country, they have their share. But indeed, that's probably not the direction that we should take. In fact, what we should ask ourselves is, what can we be able, to piggyback and, also learn from those countries and be able to implement within our countries. And I tell you, the opportunities are many. We just need to put in a little bit of innovative systems
Should
and
we be
innovation money.
piggybacking, though? Should we be piggybacking, or should we even be focusing on reducing emissions, or should we be focusing on working on the environment and making sure that we can, protect it as best we can? Because I dare say that it's not reducing emissions that's going to help in terms of climate issues in Kenya. It is working on those things and working on reversing the effects on the global scale of emissions and their effects in Kenya. So it wouldn't be reducing the emissions that would have so much effect in terms of, bettering the environment in Kenya, for example, but working on those things that protect the environment moving forward. Is that where the focus really should be for us here? Because it would seem as if the world mantra is reduce emissions, and we're all joining on that mantra, whereby the things that we need are actually being forgotten about.
Yeah, and indeed, to some extent, you are right. And this is about, we have overemphasized on what is called mitigation, and mitigation really is trying to see how can we be able to curb, the amount of emissions that we are making. But remember, there is also another perspective when it comes to climate change, and this is the adaptive capability of countries and of ecosystems. And I think that's also an area that needs to be focused more. The only challenge, and I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more, is that when it comes to adaptation, it becomes a little bit of a challenge to make business models towards that. Remember, we are talking about private sector here and how private sector can be able to engage. When we are talking about adaptive capacities and coming up with products that help us, to already accept that climate have already moved, have already changed, and what is it that we can be able to do? That's a component that, again, private sector needs seriously to look into, which is something they haven't not been looking at in the past.
So what are some of these things that private organizations need to start doing? And what kind of private organizations are we talking about now? Just those who have something to do with the environment? Are we talking about industry, manufacturing, large scale? And what is it that they need to be doing or thinking about right now?
No, I think the misconception that we have had over the time is that, we talk about climate change, and in fact, the thing that comes into your mind is energy,
Sure.
And therefore then we are looking at energy companies, we are looking at Kengen, for instance, how well are they exposed to the, renewable energy sources, how much coal that you're making. But I think it's beyond that, even in the construction, how are we making our cement? How are we making steel? When it comes to agriculture, for instance, what kind of seeds we are making? And that conversation that you're picking up there about adaptive capacity of our, of companies, seeds is one of the examples. I think it's Eric who was saying that the trees are not growing as tall as they should be. This is because, of course, climate change have happened, and therefore we need better seeds. We need seeds that can be able to cope with already what we've got as far as climate change is concerned. Seeds is another thing. Also fertilizers and organic fertilizer is also another thing. It also goes to the extent of even the pesticides that you're using, going to the biological pesticides as opposed to chemical pesticides. But it's also about mobility, transportation, and especially for us in Kenya, the public transportation. Can we be able actually to green it and make it, e-mobility, and that way then we can be able also to reduce emissions, but at the same time also we can be able to have that adaptive capacity that would be able to lead us to the next level. Also manufacturing. And this is a big component of our economy and African economies. How can we actually be able to push manufacturers, be able actually to accept that the products that they are making must be able to respect the fact that, climate change exists?
Dr. Mungai, if I am to believe the things that I have read, this isn't the first time in the history of mankind that we are having extremities in weather. We've had the Ice Age, we have the interglacial periods when there was extreme warm periods, and then the Ice Age is the extremely cold periods. The issue of rising lakes, we've had them before. sea levels rising. We've had them before. How is that different now? Because these are some of the things that we're experiencing. And people like yourself who are experts in this are telling us that these are the signs of global warming.
Yeah, I think, City, I think not too many things will eventually be new. For instance, we are talking about COVID now. Remember the Spanish flu. It's exactly the same story. The question, the bigger question is what effect do we expect and how well prepared are we as far as these things are concerned, And we have an opportunity, and that's the gospel really that we are preaching here, that private sector, government, individuals must be up in arms, trying obviously to make sure that we don't have devastating effects of these challenges. And I think that's the connection that I can be able to put from the historical perspective to what you're having now and what you're going to have in the future, is how well prepared are we, and as humankind, how, what mechanism have we put in place to help us achieve those, not to get into such disasters.
You see, why I bring in the historical aspect is because there are those who argue that these periods have something like 100,000-year cycles. There are those who say, I am far from being even adequately knowledgeable about this, but from my reading, that's what they say. And I'm saying, how do you explain to a lay person that if this has happened before, there were no factories, there were no carbon emissions to speak of, and yet these cycles actually took place? So what is to stop these cycles from actually going the way they're going and coming to an end, like the others came to an end?
Again, Titi, I would take the history as a baseline. And saying, well, this have happened, these were the consequences. Can we be able to pick up some lessons from that and probably be able to push forward? Here we are talking about future generations, and future generations could come in another 30 years. Now,
Yes.
Within those 30 years, we will have done, quite a huge mess to our planet that they can't be able to cope. And remember, I normally remind people that we have borrowed this world from them. So we must either make it better or leave it as we found it. And to be able to do that, obviously, is to take that responsibility is also our duty, both as individuals, companies, as government, to figure out what are the things that we need to do, of course, to curtail those things that we've seen in the past happening, and hopefully then give them a better livelihood.
What were some of the things that came out of the top of your head, Dr. Mungai, or even things that have been documented, or even plans that are being put forth? If we're saying that we need to take care of this planet, what are we saying needs to be done today, apart from this whole reduction of emissions? Because that on its own can be quite controversial in terms of who's doing what. But then moving forward, what are some of the things that you see are clear, whether it's on an individual basis, whether it's company, industry, government? What are some of those things that we're talking about today?
I think the bottom line still is about emissions, and that's the conversation. But the bigger question now is, what is it that government, for instance, can do, obviously, to ensure that there is to reduce the emissions, but also to help people cope. And there are a couple of things that which comes in top of my mind. Government needs really to do three things, in my honest opinion, or three things. One is, first of all, they need to categorize demand. And how do they categorize demand of, green products which have respected the fact that they are not emitting too much, or they are taking care of our environment? And how do you categorize that demand? Is by obviously creating quite a bit of awareness. And of course, this is not only a government role, but like, for instance, what we are doing here, educating Kenyans and telling Kenyans that this is real, and this is probably what we need to do. There is need for a lot of gospel to be preached about that. The second thing that government obviously need to do is, and this also touches a little bit about what private sector is expected, is also to categorize risk appetite when it comes to financing, For instance, we now have climate change fund, which is being set up by the ministry and together with Treasury. Again, the resources there should be used in such a way that they are able to categorize research and development within organization. They can also be able to help, and I'm not calling about subsidies here, is ways that they can be able to make sure that they are making programs to be more bankable, such that the private sector now can be able to come in, what we call blended finance. Can they be able to create room for blended finance? And I think the last thing that would also be very important is to create an enabling environment. An enabling environment here is where we are saying policies and standards that the government is making should, first of all, be evidence-based, meaning that they are as a result of what we are seeing on the ground, but more importantly, is that they listen to innovators, because all over the world, innovation is always ahead of policy. We will come, as Kenya Climate Innovation Center, will come up with truly nice innovations, but unfortunately, sometimes we can't be able to put them into the market because there is no standards. For instance, packaging of biogas. There's no standard for packaging of biogas in this country. If indeed we had that, then we had more companies, heading towards that, and probably LPG, we would reduce exposure to LPG. When it comes to individuals, I think the key point here is that we must take responsibility. It's change of behavior. And of course, he's also asking the individuals in terms of consumption and production that they do it in a more sustainable way. And I did research, I think in 2019, and it was surprising to see that Kenyans, 57% of Kenyans are actually saying they want to buy from sustainable companies, including climate change, which is part of the sustainability agenda. And that's truly a good indicator. Of course, globally is about 70%, but we are headed there. That means that they will be able to push companies. They will also be able to push government in a way to be able to put mechanisms that would help us to navigate through this challenge. And for private sector, they must recognize that what we are asking them to do, or what they are doing, this good that they are doing is also good business. And this, I think, is the biggest dilemma. That it's sometimes very expensive to do green stuff, to do environmental friendly stuff within organization, and to embed that within their strategy. But they must also recognize that it creates revenues, it cuts costs, it gives them social license to operate, and at the same time is build the reputation, but more importantly is risk management mechanism. And through these incentives and through these, ideas, then all of us would be able to join the bandwagon, and before we know it, we will be at a better place.
We're having a conversation on climate change and what needs to be done, especially the role of government, which is what Dr. Edward Mungai, the CEO of the Kenya Climate Innovation Center, has just been talking about. We talk about the role of the private sector, the role of development partners. Let's also talk about the role of citizens when we come out of this break.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day. Spice up your life.
Joining us on the line this morning is Dr. Edward Mungai. He is the Group CEO of the Kenya Climate Innovation Center. We're talking about climate change and agri-talk in the Situation Room. Remember, this is where we encourage and promote discourse on sustainable agriculture, agribusiness, food security, and of course, when you talk about climate change, all those things now have a tie-in into our food security and sustainability. Dr. Mungai, I want to go back into the question that City was asking. When those that talk about climate change, and then those who want to bring in the contrarian arguments will say, but we've seen these things happening. If you are now to respond to them and paint a picture, we have even seen some people saying, the way the world is going, things will really be different by the time we hit 2030. Others, by the time we hit 2050, there will be severe impact of climate change that will be, measurable. What is it that you would say? What are the imminent dangers that we face if we continue with life as we are without considering the impact of climate change?
I mean, the easiest one that I can think about, and is something that some people sometimes say that I'm joking around. I tell people, being who I am, and from central Kenya, I should go to Voi and get myself a plot there, because the Indian Ocean will be reaching to Voi, and this is because of climate change. So we should start speculating. These are some of the effects that we are going to see, that there will be a lot of displacement of people. And of course, that's on the bigger scale. But I think also on the smaller scale, some of the diseases that you are seeing are well attributed to issues of climate change. Some also in terms of the productivity, in terms of agriculture. What we are seeing is also, as the effect of climate change. We've also seen the cost of living also going up, because things like water will definitely become scarce, and that's why we keep on, pushing that we need to start figuring out how can we recycle, how can we reuse water, so that then we can be able to protect that resource. And not only for that,
So we have
but also
melting
for other
glaciers
resources.
and we have less water.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. We have excessive rainfall that we don't know what to do with, and we have less water. Dr. Please explain this to us.
Yes, and again, as I said, these are interesting stuff. Some places will have more water, others will have less water. For instance, you will expect that places which didn't have water because all of a sudden of climate change, and because of where they are positioned, they have more water. And indeed, the effect of climate change, as you rightly pick it, will be different from different places. And that is what, of course, the baseline is telling us. And more importantly, is that we should work towards, now we have baseline, what is it that we can do on different spaces and what, the effect will be. So I agree with you that it will be different for different places.
Dr. Explain to us what this term we keep hearing from people who are in your line of work, greenhouse gas emissions. What on earth are these, and why are they called greenhouse as opposed to red house?
Because and yet we're encouraging greenhouse farming.
Yes.
Well, interesting. And those are two different concepts. The one for greenhouse and the gases, and the one for greenhouse. But I think the key point here is that, as we keep on producing, we emit carbon. And carbon dioxide is just one of the, of the gases that is depleting the ozone layer. Now, the moment it continue, of course, there are other gases like methane, which are even worse, but the quantum of it is not as much as the carbon that you're producing. Now, the moment they keep on hitting the ozone layer, what then happens is that, it gets depleted, and then we get more exposure to the sun. And once you get more exposure to the sun, the world starts getting warming. That's why you hear us talking about we must maintain at 1.5 degrees centigrade, because otherwise beyond that, then it will be a huge challenge. But at the same time, we need them to bring our emissions to zero. And that brings the concept of net zero. And net zero does not necessarily mean that we have to be producing things at zero. We can actually be able to produce them a little bit more with emissions, but on the other side, we figure out how we can offset those emissions. And then we get to a position which is called net zero position.
There's some countries that don't seem to be playing ball with this, getting to this net zero emissions, and decided that, okay, well, you guys can have this conversation as far as you'd like it, but we're just really not interested in this. So there's this clamor and push, for countries on the other side of the pond to do this. So how are we going to do it if we're not in congruence, we're not working together? How will it really come about?
Well, unfortunately, it will be a difficult journey. And as I said, we have all to play ball, and until people can be able to see and make sense of what is going on, and I'm happy to see what is happening in the U.S. now, they are now playing ball, they are into the game, and they have gone back to, to the Paris Agreement. And this is really a sign of confidence, because even those doubting Thomases that were not, accepting this whole concept are now getting to it, and hopefully then all of us, the 192 countries, I guess, we can be able to push towards, mitigating and adapting to climate change. And I agree, it's a game that must be won by all and must be played by all.
Okay.
But honestly, has there been progress being made by the world? If you think about the number of years that the issue of climate change has been talked about, from the 70s, the 80s, remember Mzee Moi going to, was it Mexico? And still addressing issues of climate change. Up to now, we are still arguing about it. Has there been progress from where you sit by the world, coming together towards addressing this particular issue?
I must say that, Eric, there is quite a bit of progress. The only problem is that the issue that you are dealing with here is a big issue. And even with a small progress, sometimes it doesn't get noticed. I mean, let's look into our particular country. Let's just focus on to Kenya and see the things that we have done in this country. May it be from the regulation side. Government of Kenya have been in the forefront, for instance, to give us a Climate Change Act, which is the first one in Africa. We have now just submitted, national designated contribution to the, to as far as the Paris Agreement is concerned. And Kenya is one of the two countries which upped their game, We said we are moving, I think, from 27% to about 30% reduction on emissions, At the same time, when you look at the private sector and innovators and entrepreneurs, and that is my forte, this is where we are seeing quite a bit of action. And I know we talked about individuals and what individuals can be able to do. Really is about, getting to change the way they are consuming. And if they are changing the way they are consuming, it requires new products. And those new products must be provided through the innovation systems. And those innovation systems is really from the small scale, is what we are seeing a lot of companies coming up with innovative, and also big companies. I mean, look at people like Kenya Commercial Bank, look at Safaricom. They are all now committing to what is called net zero. Of course, there is a big conversation about that and what it means and whether they understand what they are talking about. Committing is one thing, implementing is another, but already is a good start, because then you can start having conversations and how they can be able to take that forward. So I think there is, if you ask me, there is quite a bit of progress. It's only that the issue that you're dealing with here is a massive issue, and it takes time.
And, okay, of all the human activities that clearly contribute to this climate change, because clearly it's human activities, if this were a competition and we're saying number one contributor to climate change, where would you place it?
Well, we'll put it in manufacturing, actually. And, the second one would be following very closely is agriculture. Why I say manufacturing is that until we figure out how do we produce cement with net zero perspective, how do we produce steel with net zero perspective, how do we even make, the products that we are making with reduced use of resources, reduced, emissions, then we have won the game. When it comes to agriculture, we are still using the traditional agriculture, and we need to start figuring out how can we actually green our agriculture through what is called climate smart agriculture. Okay. So I'll put it to those two sectors. Unfortunately, CT, when it comes to energy, I think that's why a lot of emphasis globally and also locally have been, there have been a lot of emphasis when it comes to energy. And I think we have seen a lot of traction, and therefore I would put it as number 3 ahead of, with manufacturing and agriculture being on top.
So manufacturing, agriculture, all these consume energy. So I would argue that the source of that energy is also a huge contributor to what we are now saying, or the emission of what we're calling the greenhouse gases. Now, the antithesis to this is what we call clean energy. Now, the world's biggest culprits are known, even in order of number 1, China, America, India, Russia. What have they done to change their sources of energy to ensure that the emission rates that they contribute to have been reduced significantly? Because if you look at, say, here in terms of percentages, as my colleague Ndu mentioned earlier on, what Africa does in contribution to this is statistically negligible. So, because source of energy, if it's clean, then this discussion of climate change, greenhouse emissions would be a completely different discussion, wouldn't you say, Dr. Ari?
Well, I guess it goes beyond energy, and that's what kind of I was trying to illustrate, that even manufacturing, even things like infrastructure, things like agriculture also plays part. But back to your point about renewable energy, of course, renewable energy is one of the areas that will help us to leapfrog towards that. But and it's the easy part. I mean, let me put it this way. It's the easy part. And this is the easy part that everybody has been talking about. When you go to China, now they are probably the biggest producer of solar power. When you talk about wind, they are also on the forefront, the same as India. And indeed, what they have done is that they have transitioned towards renewable energy sources. And as I say, this is the easiest.
But to what degree and how significant is it?
Well, and it's huge, I can tell you. When you talk about China, they are talking about 10 gigawatts, of energy being added into the system almost on a yearly basis from renewable sources of energy. And indeed, it's about the commitment that those governments have made. But as I was saying, this is the easy part, The hard part is that, can they tell us how they can be able to produce cement, how they can be able to produce steel, which they are using in millions or billions of tons, and make it green? And that's why it calls for innovation. And that is where now the contention is. Can they, and as well for us, can we be able, to green our systems of production and, make them greener?
Is it a priority? Because we look at some of the things that you talk about now in terms of innovation, and these are countries that have been able to do fantastic things in terms of innovation in other sectors. So if you're saying that innovation then is required, creativity is then required to make sure that the processes that they go through that in terms of manufacturing and industry are actually green. It would appear to me that innovation in terms of ideas is not their problem. But then you would have to ask is it a priority right now? The conversations have been had for years, 20 plus years, maybe 30 or 40, about climate change and the need to go green. I think we've heard these taglines and slogans from when we're very, very young. But is it truly a priority? I mean, it's really nice to have these world and global conferences over and over and over again and talk about these things. But is it a priority from those who are using the billions of tons every year to actually innovate and go green? It's nice to talk about it, but is it actually a priority to get it done?
In fact, if I may add to what Ndu is asking, when we talk about fossil fuels are considered a big culprit in these CO2 emissions. Right, they're innovating with solar power, wind power, heat, whatever. But are they also reducing their consumptions
Exactly.
of these fossil fuels? Because if the two are not in tandem, then really, what are we achieving?
I think it goes back to that question of innovation and whether there is priority for this. And I can tell you, and this is it, there is priority for this. And for those who knows what is ahead of us, both in terms of private sector but also in government, are really pushing towards making sure that an enabling environment is put where people can be able to innovate. And this innovation is not only about technology, and this is the problem that we face, that when we talk about innovation, we are always thinking about technology. It's actually about financing mechanisms, as an example.
Yeah.
And the issue that I was talking about, blended finance, let me just take back to Kenya and talk about what KCIC is doing and what development partners are doing and what government is doing. In us trying to help, small and medium enterprises, obviously, to play into this level, one of the biggest hindrances that they face is financing. Of course, remember, we still go to our banks, and the loan application forms is those forms that we used 10 years ago. But we moved on, The banks themselves and the financing system is not as innovative as it should be when it comes to the structuring of the financing instruments. Mm-hmm. For instance, it could be having something called proof of concept as an example. Yep. I have an idea. I can be able to solve climate change challenge in this particular way within the agriculture sector. Mm-hmm. Can I get some sort of financing, say 5 million shillings, which then can help me to leapfrog and to see whether actually my idea works? And if then that can be provided and I fail, well, there's no consequences. There are no consequences that can come out of it. It's a nice story written so that nobody ever tries that again. Yep. But if I succeed in this case, then I get more money. And before I know it, I have the commercial banks now putting into my project and scaling it, because also scale is what is important. Yeah. So that's one perspective. That innovative must also be from finance perspective. But I think it's also about business models. How are we delivering the services to the people? And that, if we can be able to be more innovative and create things that can be able to, change the way traditional we have presented things, it will also solve the challenge. And finally, it's also about the policy issues that I was talking about. And indeed, if we can put all things together, and I think globally, this is what is missing. Connecting all this, this framework and helping government, private sector, financiers all coming together and saying, we champion this and we move it forward. It is coming. This is the good news. It is coming because we can clearly see, and the lessons that you are drawing from the COVID pandemic, we have now sobered up. And for sure, in the next coming few years, I'm sure we'll be able to see some traction there.
What progress is being made on that front? When you talk about, for example, financial innovation, I would imagine that such kind of funds, like the way you've just said, the proof of concept, for example, funding, would need to come from government or such other institutions like World Bank and such, development partners. Do we have like a consortium of development partners and government working together to put a fund together to help such innovations in Kenya?
Well, there is obviously different funds, and obviously I'm sitting on one, which is called Kenya Climate Ventures, which is a, Danish government as a development partner, private sector as KCIC getting there, and also having, Treasury supporting us. And also, remember just the other day, KCB, for instance, was accredited for what is called Global Climate Fund, the Financing Fund, GCF. All these are mechanisms that are helping towards, financing. But that's just a third of the problem. There is also other problems. But I think as far as that is concerned, we have seen some traction. Of course, we need more actors working together. The unfortunate thing, Eric, here is that also, I think we sometimes work in silos. And we cannot fight a pandemic, we cannot fight climate change if we work in silos. So indeed, what you are saying, and that I think was also the intentions of this climate fund that was being set up by the Treasury, that we can be able to pull the resources together and the knowledge together, and hopefully from there we can be able to leverage and, synergize and have maximum impact.
If we were to, say, put side by side what we call renewable energy, and we put it alongside energy produced by fossil fuels in Kenya, which would you say is a cheaper option?
Good question. When talking about renewable energy, in the beginning is more expensive. But I must also say that if you compare the prices 5 years ago and the prices today, for instance, of generating 1 mega of wind, I think about 10 years ago it was about $2 million. Today we are talking about 1.5 to about 1.2 million to be able to produce that. In the real sense, the initial investment, and that's where innovation in finance comes in, is expensive. But when it comes to operational costs and delivering that power, it becomes more cheaper. So in the overall and in the long run, renewable energy sources of energy for sure will be cheaper than what is called from non-renewable.
What about solar?
In the same concept. When you look at solar, and now we have seen quite a bit of traction also in our country where we have a lot of EPC contractors, meaning, who are going out and putting up what is called captive power. And we have seen, of course, because of the, lowering of the prices of installation of solar, we have seen more companies now, including threatening KPLC or Kenya Power, in terms of them, putting what is called captive power. And what is captive power? If I'm using, and a good example is Strathmore University, they do have, a power plant which is driven by solar, 600 kilowatts. Otherwise, they would have bought that from Kenya Power. But they decided, why can't we invest upfront? And then we now start, one, using our own power, but two, also selling a little bit to Kenya Power as on a pilot basis. And this is what is becoming exciting for companies. It is the captive power that many companies are working. But as I said, financing part of it need to be figured out. And also the policy issues, because Kenya Power and, Energy Regulatory Authority will come in and say, well, what are the regulations here? And they must be able to enable that process so that more people can be able to uptake this captive power.
You talk about people coming together and having to work, Dr. Mungai, having to work together, and also see then having to work together, private sector and government. We're talking about a government, as with many other governments in the last 1 year, is struggling quite some, especially because of things like COVID. We're looking at a country like Kenya that has been struggling economically. So there are very many things that are on the plate in terms of priority. Very, very many things. We can count them and we probably would not be done in the next 10 minutes. However, this now is saying that it's a conversation that needs to take a position front and center, weighing the priority, the heaviness of things that the country needs in terms of attention vis-a-vis this. Do you think that enough attention would be given to really fighting and working on this climate change issue?
Well, I think to be fair enough to the government, I think they've done their share and they are still keep on pushing. As I said, when we are talking about the NDC that Kenya submitted in December, clearly it was one of the most, innovative and most creative and, forward-looking and to some extent, even to the extent of giving, higher amount of emissions that we should be able to cut by, 2030. And from that perspective, I think they are committed. I, however, think that they need to tap on, the knowledge, the resources, and, put people together, because the role of government is really not doing business. They need just to enable, and they just need to put the right people together, and those people then can be able to come up with solutions. And you'll be surprised. For instance, from the government side, it doesn't cost probably a lot of money. What you just need is about that enabling environment. And private sector, believe me, when there's a business case, they will be all over it, and they will be able to take it to the next level.
So, Dr. Mungai, there's a lot that your organization has been doing in bringing together the private sector, development partners, towards seeing how, as a country, then we can, address the challenges of climate change. What are some of the main gains that you can, sit today and boast and say, with KCIC, this is what has happened, this is the progress that's being made so far?
I mean, let me just take one from the policy side of things. A couple of years back, we were struggling with a few of our companies which were making, they were trying to use what is called technical alcohol to make it, a cooking material to replace kerosene. And when we looked a little bit deeper into that, we saw that they were not competitive at all because of the tax regime and tax consequences, because, technical alcohol and beverage alcohol was taxed at the same rate when it comes to excise duty. And this is something that then, obviously, with the help of government, again, they gave us a possibility of doing a pilot in Kisumu and Kibera to try and test whether this cooking substitute could work. And eventually, once we did that and we gave them that evidence, then they changed the rules. Now you have a brand new industry, which is bioethanol for cooking. That is coming from innovation. So I would say, and also working very closely with government to provide that enabling environment. So I would think that's, that's a game changer. And hopefully we'll be able to see it scaling. When you go to parties, I'm sure you see these chairs that they're using also to warm the food. They're also using sometimes in the homes. And the beauty of it is also a health solution, but also is a climate solution. I think the other thing is also in terms of agriculture and what we have seen, especially for the people in our captive areas, we have seen productivity, going up to the level of 17%. And this is because of the new ways of production, meaning climate smart agriculture becoming, more relevant. I must also say, the World Bank, for instance, have put, again, based on this evidence that we have seen on the ground, have put about $150 million, which is specifically going for climate smart agriculture and trying to see how they can be able to scale that up, I think also the other success that I must also say here is that we've also catalyzed the financial sector, where we have been giving this proof of concept, early stage financing through, one of our subsidiary, Kenya Climate Ventures. And by doing that, what we have seen our businesses attracting more money from, commercial banks, places where they couldn't, do that before, because the bank would ask, show us 2,000 items you've made. But already we have figured out that for them. We've given the financing, and once they go to bank, they have a bankable solution, which then can be funded by the bank. And those just a few to mention. Of course, along the way, we have created jobs, Eric, because that's also a very important point, that we must also not only deal with climate change. There are also other social issues, As we do develop these companies, we must also be able to create jobs, which is against the myth that, this green transition leads to loss of jobs.
Yeah.
That is not true. It's actually create jobs.
You talked about climate smart agriculture. What's that? And what example do we have in Kenya?
Yeah, I mean, I can give you a good example would be like what I was talking about, biopesticides, where people are no longer using, pesticide made from chemical fertilizers, and also chemical fertilizers. I mean, pesticide made from chemicals and not using, chemical fertilizers, but they are using, like, for instance, they have vermiculture. Vermiculture is where you have worms, and those worms, once they feed on matter, then they decompose that matter, and you can use it as good manure, which have a lot of nitrogen. It's also about coming up with modes that then, or biological pesticides that then will be able to deal with some of the diseases. It's also about, technologies like hydroponics, which is the art of growing crops with, very little water and without soil, and we are saving about 70% of the water. These are kind of the, the things. It's also about solar-driven irrigation systems, which then can also be able to help our farmers. So it's all different sort of things, Eric, that are exciting and also give better livelihoods to people.
Dr. Do you have a plan, or do you have you set in motion a plan that includes the requisite ministries, within government and perhaps within the county governments, to ensure that the things that we are talking about here and the innovations and the planning and the thinking that you have is cascaded through the requisite ministries to the mwananchi?
Yeah, I would say to some extent, and in fact, that's why we started our conversation when we were talking about this demand catalyzation. That demand catalyzation is actually about, creating awareness and telling people that if you continue, cooking using wood fuel as an example, these have consequences in terms of your brain, your eyesight, in terms of your breathing system and all those, and therefore you need to do something about it. But talking about, government and having conversations with ministries, yes, indeed, this is something that is in motion. For instance, our ministry, our parent ministry, if you like, is the Ministry of Environment. We work very closely as far as these matters are concerned. We are also working with Ministry of Agriculture because of climate smart agriculture, and more important, Ministry of Trade and Industrialization, but also energy. When it comes to the counties, some of them are very progressive, actually. You'll be surprised. And, we have these CIDPs, and you can see clearly they even have climate policies within that. Fortunately, now we have a funding from the European delegation in Kenya, which is it's more about agriculture, but working with counties. And again, this is a concept that we want to mainstream as they work on agriculture. We want to help them to mainstream, climate change within their activities.
Thank you very much. Dr. Edward Mungai is the CEO of the Kenya Climate Innovation Center. We've been having a conversation with him on the matter of climate change mitigation programs, what the private sector is doing, what the government is doing, what development partners and organizations such as the World Bank are doing, and you've told us about the Danish government and very many others and what they're doing and what we ought to know as citizens and what then we can contribute. Thank you very much, Doc, for this conversation. We hope to host you again in the studio soon.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, CT and Du, for hosting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very enlightening conversation, Dr. Thank you.
Thank you.
And have a lovely day.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day. Spice up your life.